Good morning and welcome to the June UCLA Anderson Forecast Conference, jointly held with the UCLA Anderson Ziman Center for Real Estate. I'm Jerry Nicholsberg, Director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast, and I'll be the Zoom Master of Ceremonies this morning. I will also be speaking on the outlook for California in a little while. We have a full program today, so please stay tuned. We'll have a break in the middle as we do with our on-campus programs. But if you need to leave for a short time during the program, please do come back. We have insightful and engaging speakers throughout the morning. And if you happen to be inside the paywall, we have our interactive conversation with the economists beginning at about 11:30. To say these are uncertain times is an understatement, but it is also a time for those of us engaged in economic forecasting to be humble about what we do and do not know. We hope to give you a roadmap to understand the economy as it unfolds in our discussion today, and to not overstate the accuracy nor the certainty of our forecasts. We are focusing on the economy. However, there's another important current running through our society at present, that of Black Lives Matter. 5 days ago, we observed Juneteenth. On that day, the Chancellor of UCLA, Gene Block, had this message, which I would like to read to you. UCLA alumnus Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has powerfully observed that, quote, racism in America is like dust in the air. It seems invisible, even if you're choking on it, until you let the sun in. Then you see it everywhere. As long as we keep shining that light, we have a chance of cleaning it wherever it lands, end quote. Shining that light and doing the real work of change is never easy. It requires honest reflection, moral courage, and purposeful action. That is the price we must pay for the world we want. Like the dust Kareem describes, racism permeates every sector of our society, from education to employment, from housing to healthcare, from boardrooms to courtrooms. Racial justice is a goal that must compel every one of us. None of us can be all we want to be until all of us can be all we want to be. Therefore, on this Juneteenth, we ask every Bruin to ask themselves how they can do more to combat racism in all its forms, to end anti-Black bias especially, and to achieve racial equity, inclusion, and justice for all. Please be assured that UCLA is doing the same. That's the end of Gene's comments, and I would like to add that UCLA Anderson and the UCLA Anderson forecast is as well. Now, we have a great program today focusing on the outlook for the economy and zeroing in on the outlook for housing. As you know, we are a public institution, and budgets are very much the subject of the vagaries of public revenue streams. We could not bring you quality programs like this without our sponsors, and we are deeply appreciative of their standing with us during these difficult times. So I'd like to recognize our sponsors. Our principal sponsor today is the audit, tax, and consulting firm of RSM. Our platinum sponsor, the law firms of Allen Matkins, and you're going to hear more about the survey that they also fund and participate in later in the program, and University Credit Union, who began actually here on the campus of UCLA in 1951. Our gold level sponsors are Robert Half, United Airlines, and Wells Fargo, the private bank, and we thank our gold level sponsors. At the silver level, California Bank and Trust, Cathay Bank, CenturyLink, Landsea Homes, Pacific Western Bank, and Zurich North America Insurance and Risk Management, and we thank our silver level sponsors. At the bronze level, Alba Wheels Up, CBRE, Clark Construction Group, Colliers International, Homni Bank, Hathaway Dinwiddie, Marsh & McClellan Insurance Agency, MBK Real Estate Companies, Partner Engineering and Science, and Union Bank, the private bank. And thank you to our bronze level sponsors. At the Bruin level, Gerber Kawasaki Wealth and Investment Management. Our media sponsor today is the Los Angeles Business Journal, and our academic sponsor, UCLA Extension. Many thanks to them as well, and to all of our new, continuing, and returning sponsors. Your support is invaluable and greatly appreciated. And if you did not hear the name of your company, please get in touch with us. We would love to have you as part of our sponsors and supporting our programs. Now, we're going to begin our program today with the forecast presentation. And first up will be David Schulman. David will give us the U.S. economic outlook. David earned his PhD in finance at UCLA Anderson and has had a distinguished career in academia with a prize for excellence in teaching named for him and a distinguished career on Wall Street. He returned to the Anderson forecast 15 years ago. David is retiring from the forecast after the event today. However, as Ed Leamer clearly demonstrates, the forecast is a bit like Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. So David will be coming back from time to time to share his insights and wisdom on finance and real estate. David, from all of us at the forecast, we wish you the very best in your retirement, and we are grateful and thankful for your years of service to Anderson and the forecast. And we look forward to seeing you at events in the future. Now, we had planned on giving you a token of our appreciation in person, but now we'll have to be virtual and mailed to you. So I think, George, you have something that you can show? You have to hold it up a little higher. So this is on the way to you, David, just a small token to say thank you. And it is a real heartfelt thank from all of us at Anderson and at the Anderson forecast. Following the US forecast, Professor Ed Leamer will present his research on evaluating the length and strength of a recovery. Ed has been with Anderson for over 40 years, including 17 as the director, and he's been our mentor and sage for a very long time. I will follow Ed with the California outlook, and following my presentation will be Laila Bengali with research on housing and how policy and the pandemic has affected it. Laila comes to us from Yale University, and her work is on the California economy, the Bay Area economy, and policy issues affecting California. And then for the balance of the first part of our program, we have a conversation with John Tipton, partner at Allen Matkins, in which we bring you the first results from the Allen Matkins UCLA Anderson Forecast California Commercial Real Estate Survey. So stay tuned for that. That might be a bit surprising to some of you. Then we're going to have our break. So that'll be our time to stretch. And the break will be about 10 minutes. And that'll be followed by 3 conversations on the post-COVID-19 urban landscape with Richard Florida, the state of the U.S. housing market with Ivy Zellman, and affordability in California with Connor Doherty. And those are going to be fascinating conversations. For those inside the paywall, once again, there will be an interactive discussion with the economists following the conversations. You have been sent a Slido key, and if you don't have Slido, please download it, it's free. Enter the key, and then you can ask your questions or vote on questions that have already been asked. And when we get to the interactive discussion, we'll be looking at those questions from the Slido submission. So please be entering those as we go along. So now let's turn to David Schulman. And David, what is going on with the U.S. economy?
Okay, we're good. So what I'd like to discuss, as I mentioned, we have three famous economists, Mother Goose, V.I. Lenin, and Niels Bohr. And our quote from Mother Goose on the recovery is, "It will take time for all the king's horses and all the king's men to put the economy back together again." And our view is that this is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. It's going to take quite some time to get back to the fourth quarter of 2019, or for GDP, and the February for employment. And this is sort of a Mother Goose. This is Humpty Dumpty. The economy has had a very, very big fall, and lots of things in the economy have been broken, especially in the restaurants, hotel area, airlines, whole host of personal services that will take time to recover. It will not happen. It will not happen right away, even if we have a vaccine, even if we got a vaccine for COVID tomorrow. And we're making 3 critical assumptions. First one is the public schools largely reopened in the fall. 2, there'll be a start-stop return of the pandemic in the fall. There may be some regional shutdowns of the economy, but not nationally. There'll be a vaccine available around the first quarter of next year. but it will take time to inoculate the public, or alternatively, the pandemic runs its course, which we don't think will happen, but that could happen as well. Our themes are, we had a 40% drop, and that's at an annual rate in real GDP, so that's like about 10% decline in absolute numbers in the second quarter, and the recovery will look like a Nike swoosh symbol. We don't have real GDP coming back until 2023, and employment will be much later than that. We've had an extraordinary monetary and fiscal response to the crisis, and that's helped a great deal. We have inflation staying very low for now, but much higher later is a real risk. We think suburban housing is a bright spot. Longer term, we think the pandemic has accelerated existing trends, i.e. the trend towards e-commerce and trade tensions with China and the digitization of the economy. And what's new is we think the economy is going to shift from a focus on efficiency to a focus on resilience. Work from home will become far more normal. We're going to re-suburbanize the economy, and we also think the higher ed bubble is going to pop. This is what a Nike swoosh looks like if you haven't seen it: a quick drop and then a gradual recovery. This is the real GDP. We started around 19 trillion. It's going to drop to below 17 trillion in the current quarter. So that's about 12% cumulative, 13% drop. And then we get a gradual recovery. You say this more looks like a V than a swoosh. But if you look at employment looks much more like that Nike swoosh, where employment dropped from about 152 million jobs to about 132 million jobs in the face of a couple of months. These are quarterly data. We get a recovery, but if you note that by the end of 2022, we're still down by about 5 million jobs from the prior peak, because a lot of those jobs probably will not come back. We'll have less hotels in the economy, and we think we'll have less restaurants. And all this is a lot of businesses will have discovered, and also government will have discovered, that some employees really weren't necessary, and they may not come back for a while. Here's the unemployment rate, which we're going rate around 3.5%, and then we get this unprecedented rise to 14%, near 14%, and gradually comes down to 6.5% by the end of 2022. There's a lot of data issues with the last unemployment report, so it is not clear that the 14% that was printed for April was the right number, because if calculated a different way, it could have been about 18%. So our sense is we're using the official data, the Fed is using the official data, so we'll see what happens. We may get a better idea in the first Friday in July when we get the June employment report. The federal government has acted with unusual alacrity. The CARES Act put $1.8 trillion into the economy. We have about $3 trillion deficit for this year. Likely there will be a new stimulus, and the new stimulus probably will add another $1 trillion to the deficit, and that'll probably come in late July, and some of that will be to continue some of the income relief programs that were put in place with the CARES Act. It's likely that a lot of that will be continued going forward for at least another 6 months or so. The Fed has gone all out. The Fed has expanded its balance sheet by around $3 trillion in the space of 3 months. This is unprecedented. The increase of $3 trillion is equal to the Fed balance sheet in 2012. So the Fed is basically taking all kinds of credit risk, is going where no Fed has ever gone before. And in fact, I told Jerry and Ed to securitize their personal IOUs, and the Fed will, in all likelihood, will buy them. That's how aggressive the Fed has been, and we suspect that the balance sheet will total 10 trillion by the end of the year. Truly extraordinary monetary policy, and this is showing up in M2 growth. And folks haven't looked at money for a long time as a force for inflation, as a force for growth. And if you take a look at it, we're now running at around a 24% annual rate, year-over-year rate, well below the 5% rate that it's been running at for the past 25 years or so, and more than double what happened in the 2010-2012 time period. So something is going on. Some of that is coming from the federal stimulus package, where they basically mail checks to people, which created deposits. Some of it is as businesses drawing down their lines of credit, and when a business draws down its line of credit, it creates a loan and it creates a concomitant deposit with that. So this is something to think about, not necessarily today, but maybe down the line. Interest rates will remain set at 0 for the entire forecast period. We have the long bond basically settling in around 1%, the 10-year Treasury, once we see some recovery in output, which will happen in the third quarter. And one of the issues is the Fed may adopt a yield curve maintenance program, which is what they did to finance World War II, where from 1939 to 1951, the Federal Reserve pegged the interest rate on long-term treasuries. They might do that. They might do that again, and that's something we'll wait to see what they say in the future policy pronouncements. That's also something to watch. And part of the reason why we have interest rates going up is we do have the economy growing at 4 to 5% in 2022, and so we don't think it'll be possible to sustain a 1% 10-year Treasury. So that will work higher unless the Fed decides to do a maintenance program. Inflation we have very low. The big drop in the second quarter you see here in 2020 is due to the collapse in oil prices. The big rise you see when we anniversary those in the second quarter of 2021. So we have headline inflation going back over 2%, then coming down a bit. And we have core inflation dropping at around 0.5% year over year in the beginning of 2021, and then going up to about 1.5%. Still well below the Fed's 2% long-term target. So near term, we don't see much risk with respect to higher inflation. We also don't see deflation given all the monetization that's going on. Now, question is, why could inflation be higher later? Well, theoretically, people have talked about 3 causes of inflation. 1 is monetary, we certainly have that. 2 is fiscal, we certainly have that, check. 3 is cost push, that will come from trade tensions and having an economy more concerned about resilience than efficiency, check. So those three things create a mix to have inflation later. We won't have it now with all this unemployment, and we won't have this now with all this huge increase in debt on the part of the corporate sector, which will take time to pay down, but it's out there. And unlike 2011 to 2015, we don't think there'll be a regulatory push to restore liquidity in the banking system caused by Dodd-Frank. And we also don't see any quick return to fiscal austerity that happened a decade ago, which happened both here in the US, where deficit reduction became the mantra, and we certainly won't see it again in Europe. So that's out there. It's not in the market right now, but maybe by the end of 2022, it'll begin to be priced in. Housing is doing much better than we thought. We thought housing starts in the current quarter would drop down to around 600,000. It's going to end up around 900,000. Much better. And near term is we're probably low. You're going to hear from Ivy Zellman later, and she's more optimistic than this forecast is near term. But for 2022, we end up pretty much at the same level of housing starts. But housing is doing much better than we thought, and most of the activity is in the suburbs. Now, let's talk about the post-COVID world. Lenin said, or attributed to Lenin, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. We think this is what's happened now. But we caution, it is very hard. Niels Bohr, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said it is very hard to predict, especially about the future. But let's talk about some speculation. One is we have online shopping has accelerated. In April, online shopping accounted for 28% of the retail sales, not counting gasoline, automobiles, and restaurants, up from 21% a year ago. We didn't think we'd be at 25% until 2025. We're hitting 28% right now. That's accelerated. I think we're accelerating the whole tensions with China, and it seems we're in a new Cold War with China. And that's going to cause the economy to move from efficiency to resilience, because we can't rely on one country or two countries for critical supplies of a whole host of goods. We think this will trigger, because of the deficits, we will have higher federal taxes, and we also think there'll be higher social and infrastructure spending going forward. Importantly, we think work from home is here to stay. About 38% of the jobs are amenable in the country to work from home. We think there'll be reduced urban densities. We think we will re-suburbanize. We think we will re-suburbanize the housing market, in the sense that, and mid-sized cities will tend to win. And by what we mean is, if you work, the thing is we don't think in the current environment will work from home being very, very successful for a host of corporations. And we have a host of businesses basically totally reevaluating the need for office space. And there was a recent announcement by UBS, a global investment bank and wealth manager. They assume 1/3 of their employees are going to be working from home on a permanent basis. So most businesses are reevaluating this work from home experiment, which seems to have been reasonably successful. Work from home might mean work from anywhere, because they don't know where you are. So you could be in your flip-flops on the beach and hard at work. And this, I think, will make mid-sized cities more attractive, which have amenities but have much lower rents. And it's hard to, we think this will make it hard to justify people paying $3,000 to $5,000 a month for small urban apartments. We also think that mall rents are going to collapse in this environment, because retailer gross margins, because of online competition, and probably sales won't go back to where they were in the mall before. With lower gross margins, there's less ability to pay rent. Rent is paid out of gross margin, not out of sales. We also think the higher ed bubble is going to pop. There were a whole host of small colleges that were in trouble prior to the pandemic. They're in worse trouble right now. We also have real restrictions on visas, and foreign students pay full boat tuition, and that source of revenue is not going to be there. Many universities have huge medical complexes associated with them, and those hospitals, like hospitals elsewhere, suffered from the pandemic because elective surgery all but disappeared during the pandemic. So we see real issues with higher ed, and online education will become much more popular and will become a workable model. UCLA will be 90% online in the fall. So to conclude, we think we're in a Nike Swoosh recovery mode coming out of the big decline in Q2. Aggressive monetary and fiscal policy will continue. Real GDP and employment don't fully recover. Low inflation for now, but risk for much higher later. The pandemic accelerated existing trends, and we think there'll be fundamental changes in the economy going forward. Well, thank you.
Thank you, David. So now we'll turn to Ed Leamer. Ed is going to talk about this recession and the swoosh that David talked about, looking at past data to see what we can learn from that about the length and strength of the recovery. So Ed, over to you.
Okay, I'm ready to go. And I'm going to amplify what David already said, because he talked only about the recovery. We've had what looks like a 2-month recession in March and April, and it looks as though the recovery began in May. And the forecast is all about what's this recovery going to look like. So I want to look at the historical data and try to answer this question: why are some recoveries rapid and others slow? And help us think about what this recovery is going to be this time. So the National Bureau of Economic Research has a committee of PhD economists who get together and decide the official peaks and valleys of the US economy. And you see in front of you what this has produced, which is the yellow bands, which are the official recessions, and the black bands are everything else. So they have two official periods, recessions and otherwise. They don't comment about what the recovery is. So if you think about getting ill and you've got the coronavirus, you feel really bad. I mean, you're infected, but after the infection goes away, you're not back to normal. There's a recovery period. And then after potentially a long recovery, you are back to normal. So my view is we need to add the notion of recoveries into our thinking about how the economy operates, particularly right now, because all the issues is what kind of recovery we're going to have. So what is a recovery? It's a period of time in which people are being put back to work. And because they're being put back to work, you're getting supernormal GDP growth. You're getting normal growth because of productivity improvements and some additional additions to the labor force. But you're putting lots of people back to work, so you get exceptional GDP growth. In fact, David has a 4% GDP growth next year, which has to do with putting people back to work. So what variable are going to use for defining the recovery? It could be GDP, it could be the unemployment rate, it could be total payrolls. And what's the definition of recovery? When is recovery over? It could be return to previous trend, or it could be return to a previous peak. And I'm going to choose total payrolls and return to previous peak. Total payrolls are done monthly and GDP is quarterly, so I prefer the month. The unemployment rate never quite gets back to where it was before the recession began. So it gives you a totally different idea about the recovery. So I'm going to work with total payrolls. And then the problem with return to previous trend is you're going to question my choice of previous trend. And so I'm going to stick with something that is objective, which is the previous peak. So we're going to talk payrolls return to previous peak. So here's the same image that you just looked at a minute ago, except I've added the green areas. These greens are the recoveries. If you look carefully, you can see that each one of these recoveries is defined exactly what I said, which is a return to the previous peak employment. And it's worthwhile noticing that that recovery was a little longer. That was in 1990. This is a 2000 longer still. And this is 2008 and even longer still. So instead of saying long and short, let's ask the question, why have the last three recoveries been longer and longer? And what does that mean about the next recovery to come? This is another image of the same information. The horizontal here is peak to months after the peak, the scale at the bottom. And we're going to measure the departure from the peak value. That was a 1948 event, which is down about 4%. This is again payrolls, down about 4%. And you get back to where you were within 2 years, within a 24-month period. So that was 48, that's 53, 57, 60, 69, 73. Looks like they kind of missed the 73 one. Can you see that? Because you had a year of growing payrolls, and even though they called that a recession. Here's 1980, there's 1981. So the message is typically what happens in payrolls is you get a decline of 2 or 3%. By the end of 2 years, you're back to where you were before. 1990 was a little slower, like we saw before. 2001 took 4 years almost before you got back to where you were. And in 2007 was longer still, the longest one, 5 years or more. So this is the most recent information with a huge drop, an unprecedented drop in payrolls in April, a little bit of a bounce back in May, and then we've got David's forecasts, and his forecasts within the time period never get the recovery. In a sense, they're never back to where they were before. It remains to be seen how quickly this is going to get back to normal, but I'm going to argue that what matters is the trend underlying the different components of the payrolls. And David has kind of indicated several of these sectors that are going to have a new trend, meaning that the sectors that emerge at the end of this recovery period are going to be different than they were before. That's what slows down the recovery. So there's no image that has a better capture of my idea than this one here, which is manufacturing payrolls. Again, I've got the yellows representing the recessions, and I have one of them labeled as a V. You can see those V shapes in the recessions where you lose a couple million jobs and you get them back within a year. That was all in the first several decades. But beginning around 1980, we started having different kinds of spells. I labeled one L. The L was where we lost 3 million jobs and none of them came back. So the recessions and recoveries were totally different going up to 1990 than they were afterwards. And I would argue that fiscal and monetary policies don't do well with that L-shaped recovery, because you can't bring manufacturing jobs back to all those Midwestern towns that are losing them. We need to focus policy specifically on them, try to make the lives in those communities a bit better. We haven't done that. And as a consequence, we've had a kind of a huge political fallout from the lengthening of the recoveries and the fact that some of these communities never really did recover. But underlying this slide is the positive trend. I want to emphasize that a total difference between a positive trend and a negative trend. That's what produced that L. We'll come to a slide in a minute that explains that in more detail. And I just want to bring to you an optimistic view that it looks like the negative trend in manufacturing is now over, and we can feel more optimistic about what's going to happen next in the manufacturing sector. So here's the idea. The cost cutting usually involves a cut in payrolls in the recessions, and then you hire back. You don't need to hire as many as you had before because you get a productivity improvement. And then you add to that a positive secular trend, and that's what creates the happy V. Well, temporary layoffs followed by recalls. But if you have the cost cutting, you add to that negative trend, that is what creates the lazy L, which is permanent separations, jobs that are never coming back. And these individuals need to move to new sectors that require new skills, new locations, and new aspirations. That really works slowly, very slowly indeed, and it lengthens the time that the recovery is going to occur. So this is my attempt to, this is a rather complicated slide indicating the declines from peak to recovery, average of the first 8 recessions and the last 3 separately. So in the middle, that's the total payrolls, and that's basically 0 because the end of the recovery is when the payrolls are back to normal. And then over here on the left, that's durable manufacturing. You can see the black is the historical average. So that's where manufacturing was when payrolls got back to their previous peak. So durable manufacturing typically was down about 6.2% in those 8 recessions. But you can see it's been more behind in the last 3 recessions. The blue, the red, and the green have all been larger. That's what we're looking for here. We're looking for these negative blacks followed by 3 colored bars that are a little bit deeper. Here's another example is information. The last 2 bars are deeper. That's indicating that contributed to the sluggishness of the return. Non-durable manufacturing, here's construction, and because we're talking about housing, you can see the housing cycle there. With the 2000 recession, didn't have a housing downturn, but the other 2 had very sharp declines. Another thing that's very worrisome is wholesale trade and the retail trade have dropped dramatically. On the positive side is leisure and hospitality. Leisure and hospitality is shortening the length of the recoveries because these long bars are indicating that you had exceptionally powerful leisure and hospitality sectors during the period of recovery. And the other one is education health services. So we're going to look for trends in all these sectors now. This is information jobs. You can see information jobs had a positive trend and turned into a negative. That's what causes the delay in the recovery. And that seems to me to be still worrisome. Some sectors within information, like telecommunications, are still very troubled. Others are not as troubled as much. Here's construction. So here we're going to look for a trend in construction, and the top blue line says we're at a horizontal trend since the peak in 2007. But I think the right way to think about it is the white one, in which still has a positive trend, because we had a kind of a bubble in housing, and the underlying trend in construction is still positive. That gives me hope about this sector. It's not going to be a problem. Here's wholesale jobs. We're totally flat. That's a problem. Here's retail jobs, that's totally flat. You're seeing the force of technological change that is keeping the growth in both those sectors from being strong anymore. Here's leisure and hospitality. Here I was looking for some kind of bubble at the end. I don't see a bubble, so this looks okay to me. Here's education and health services. There's no bubble in jobs that has to be corrected. It's just a long-term trend with a positive trend. That looks good too. So here's we're going to look now at the 2020 recession and ask where the biggest problems were compared to the historical numbers. So we have the bars representing the first previous 4, and then the blues are the current economic downturn, and we had a 14.5% decline in payrolls, but we had almost 50% decline in leisure and hospitality, 22% decline in services, and also education and health services. Very unusual. So this is already a source of some concern. What about the recovery so far? So this is a bar that represents in blue the decline and in orange the recovery. So overall, payroll jobs declined by about 14.5% and had a slight recovery, 1.6% in May. Manufacturing is looking good. We had a decline, but we had significant recovery as expected. Non-durable manufacturing is the same thing as durable manufacturing. Construction has had a strong recovery. That makes me feel optimistic about that. Retail and wholesale trade there's no recovery here. This confirms the concern that came from looking at those slides that we saw a minute ago. Here's the leisure and hospitality where you see a significant recovery. It might be a different sector, as David suggests, so you might not get the strong recovery, but so far it looks okay. Here's education and health services where there's natural recovery, makes us feel good about that. Here's a really unusual one, is government. Government is not normally in this role where you're negative from February to April and still a negative from April to May. That's because local governments and state governments are in deep trouble and they're laying off workers, and that's likely to continue and be a source of sluggishness going forward. And there's services, again, key thing to know on that, within that service sector, it's nail salons that have been hit the hardest, 90%. So that tells you what the coronavirus does. It's real hard on face-to-face delivery of services, and that's likely to linger the way David has indicated in his forecast. So here's my summary of my findings, my pull and the struggle, push and pull between the different sectors. So I think manufacturing is looking good. There's a ray of hope. We're seeing a positive trend. We had a modest decline and significant recovery. That seems good. I think information is troubled. There was a retreat more in May. We didn't get a bounce back. Construction looks good to me. I think housing, as David said, is likely to be in a good shape because the trend is positive. We've had an excellent recovery in that sector. Wholesale and retail are, as I said before, they're very troubled, and we've got to worry about what's going to happen to those sectors. Leisure and hospitality seems to me to be a potentially important sector for reasons that David is highlighting. It's going to be hard for that to bounce back. Education and health services are bouncing back nice. That makes me feel good. And government is very worried. State and local, not federal. State and local government is a source of concern. We're extending the length of this recovery. So I've hit my 15-minute limit, and I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ed. So now we'll turn to the California report. Let me go to share screen to bring my slides up. Okay, to now turn to California, I titled my presentation The Uncertain State. So just continuing that theme that we are in uncertain times. We have, certainly made some assumptions about what we think not what we think the pandemic is going to do, but an assumption about the pandemic that allows us to do an economic forecast. But as David and Ed have indicated, these are unusual times. So I've got a couple of pictures here of Southern California icons. Disneyland is closed. Musso and Frank's is closed. And restaurants are struggling. The one on the right-hand side is Malibu Moon Shadows. That's also closed, but it has opened up his parking lot for in-car dining and trying to get by. So we are talking about this time being different, and certainly we know that nationally, but what about in California? What you see here on the left-hand side are previous recessions, and the year of those recessions, the last three that Ed talked about, 1990, 2001, and 2008. In 1990, California lost 500,000 jobs. That was 4% of all payroll jobs, and that was over a span of 35 months. And that was associated with the decline in the aerospace industry after the end of the Cold War. 2001 lost 300,000 jobs, 2% of all payroll jobs in a span of 12 months, and associated with the dot-com bust. And 2008, 1.3 million jobs lost, 8% of all payroll jobs. That's the Great Recession. And in California, it was different from the US because of the large presence of subprime mortgage finance industry in Southern California and the housing bubble. And that transpired over 26 months. This healthcare crisis or pandemic-induced recession is on the right-hand side with an employment decline of 2.625 million jobs. And that's double what we had in the Great Recession, or 15% of all payroll jobs in California, but in only 2 months. So it looks very different. And the question that we always ask is, well, this recession looks different, but how does California look different from the US? So let's turn to that and just look at a comparison. What you see here are payroll job loss, and I'm only focusing on 4 sectors, and we'll get into why those 4 sectors momentarily. But on the left-hand side is total payroll job loss. The blue block there is for the US and the gold for California. This is the percentage loss, so very similar to what Ed just showed you. And you can see they're virtually identical. They're both in the 14%. I'm looking at February to April because in May, some parts of the US were opening up, but California did not start really opening up until this month. We'll look at May in a moment and see what's happened to the California numbers in May. Moving now over to the right, leisure and hospitality. That's the next set of blocks. That's the worst job loss on a percentage basis. And California looks a lot like the US. And the other one that Ed highlighted was other services all the way over on the right. And again, California and the US, hard to tell that they are any different in terms of percentage job loss. The last two in the middle are retail, trade, and healthcare and social services. Both had a lower percentage job loss, but significant. And in both cases, they look like the US. Now, what's important in thinking about unemployment and reemployment are where are the people and how many are there. So let's turn to the number of folks who have lost their jobs. So this is the change in payroll jobs, but now number of jobs, again, February to April. And if you look on the right-hand side, you see the big drops, and that's leisure and hospitality and retail. And that's half of all jobs lost in California in those 2 sectors alone. If we expand this to the 4 sectors that I showed you before, in healthcare and social services and other services, that's 65% of all job losses, 2/3 there. Now the next 3 are administrative services, construction, and education, and we'll talk about those momentarily, but let's look at what happened in May as we move from April to May. In this chart, what you see, the blue is the job loss relative to February for May, and the red relative to February for April. And again, in leisure and hospitality and retail, about half of the jobs. So that didn't change much between the 2 months. Adding in healthcare and social services and other services, and we get the same result, 2/3 of all job losses in those 4 sectors. But let's take a look at a couple of other sectors. This is administrative services. There was some gain in jobs from April to May, but keep in mind, this is a sector that includes sanitation and janitorial services, and you would expect there to be hiring in that subsector. Next up is construction. Ed talked about construction as being a bright point. And indeed, we see hiring in construction in California between April and May. That relates a lot to our theme today. I'm going to talk a bit more about that when we get to the housing sector. And then finally, the next sector is education, and there's a further job loss in education. But that's really related to the fact that the schools are closed, so support services are not really needed in both public and private schools. So we have some erosion there. We expect that to come back as schools open up in the fall. Now, Ed talked about the stress that state and local governments are having and how that's impacting the economy. In the May budget message from the governor, he pointed out that we had a $54 billion deficit. There's now been an agreement between the governor and the legislature, and it looks like the cuts are going to be somewhere around 8% instead of the 34% that the 54 billion represents. We have an article on our website by Dan Mitchell that goes into this in detail. And so you can, kind of look at all the components. But what's important here is what the governor is pointing to, which is a slide that shows the building of a foundation, a rainy day fund. California has over $20 billion in various funds that it can draw on, in addition to additional borrowing capability. So relative to many other states, California is not in as bad shape, and certainly not in the kind of shape that the 54 billion would suggest. However, local governments that are heavily dependent on sales taxes are, and that's where I think you're going to see the stress in governments and layoffs in the public sector. So now moving on to the smaller two, the little two of those big four sectors. The first is other services, and what's in other services? That's personal care, religious organizations, and auto repair, and other maintenance. Auto repair was down kind of significantly, but we weren't driving, so one can expect that to come back. Kind of the real concern is in personal care, so haircuts probably coming back, nail salons, as Ed pointed out, may be much more delayed. However, we think overall other services are going to respond pretty much like the US. Healthcare and social services and the components of that, dental offices, physical therapy, doctor's offices, those pretty much shut down, but there's only so long that we can go without dental care and with back pain and the like. So expect those to be growing over the next 2 years. And daycare, well, daycare imploded because people weren't going to work. But as the economy opens up and people start going to work, we expect a recovery in daycare. So these smaller two are of concern, but we're expecting a reasonable recovery, basically in line with what's happening in the US. So let's turn to those big two. And before we look at more detail in the sectors, I want to point out that international tourism, which affects both retail and leisure and hospitality, are important for California. The chart that you see is overseas visitors to the US, and it's from 2018, and its market share. California is number 3 with over 20% of all international visitors. To get to California from foreign countries requires a long flight, and that's a long flight to a country that is not viewed in other parts of the world as doing a very good job battling the pandemic. Indeed, on the list of restricted travel being looked at by the EU, the United States is there with Brazil and some other countries as not yet ready to be open for travel from the US. So that's certainly going to discourage overseas travelers to California. So as we dig into this, leisure and hospitality, we have a fear of flying, both domestically and internationally. We have amusement park phobia, the fear of being in large crowds, and bar phobia, similar, but in a kind of different environment with alcohol involved. And in retail, we have brick and mortar is overbuilt. We're going to talk about more of that when we get to the Alan Matkins UCLA Anderson forecast survey, which looks at the retail sector. We have tourism that I just mentioned, as well as mall phobia, the fear of being in large crowds again. So to get a handle on this, we went to the last time we saw fear of flying. And what you see in this graph is US airline revenue passenger miles. So that's one passenger on a domestic flight who has paid for their seat flying 1 mile. And this goes from 2000 to 2004. So when 9/11 happened, we had a huge drop in airline traffic. And that's a big spike you see in the middle there. And then it starts to come back, but it takes 31 months to come back. And there have been a number of studies of this. We're referencing Ito and Lee of 2004, but there are other references in the paper. And what they do is try and separate out an income effect from the fear of flying, because in March 2001 began a recession, a very mild recession. If we substitute the loss of jobs and income in the current recession and our forecast for the recovery for the 2001 recession, we get at the end of 2022 still 20% below the peak. And when we run our models for California, that's about where we end up. So that's our expectation, is that for both retail and leisure and hospitality, we're going to be about 20% below the peak when we get to the end of our forecast horizon. So these are the sectors that are going to lag. They're also low income sectors. So the folks who are not going to be reemployed tend to be those who have the least resources to make it through this recession. Now, turning to homes, this is from California Association of Realtors. This is home sales. And in May 2020, it falls off a cliff, not surprisingly, because we couldn't go out and look at homes, and it's very hard to buy homes virtually. But if you look at prices, on the right-hand side, again from California Association of Realtors, the California median home prices in May fell, but not by very much. And on the left-hand side is the Case-Shiller Home Price Index, which lags, so this is prior to the recession, but we also don't see an erosion of prices. And all of this suggests that there's going to be a return of home building, very much like David said for the US, but a little more rapid in California. And you can see that in this chart. So the green here are actuals through 2020. We get a big drop in new residential permits in May, and then a recovery up to about 11,000 units per month. So that's going to be a bit higher on average than we have seen, although 11,000 per month is not nearly enough to make a dent in the housing affordability crisis. And we're going to have a lot more conversation about that in the second part of our program. That brings me to the California forecast. We have a decline in real personal income, peak to trough of -3%, but these numbers do not include the federal support package. That support package, if the 2008 mailing of checks of $1,000 to Americans is any indication, a lot of that has gone in the bank as reserve funds. But when we put that back in, the pattern changes a little bit, looks a little more like the US GDP, but on average for the year 2020 and 2021, they look almost the same. And in terms of payroll employment, we've got a decline in payroll employment, much greater because of the sectors or the low income sectors that are most affected here, with no return to the peak by the end of the forecast. So let me conclude with this picture of being in the woods, and we are in the woods now looking at the trees. Hopefully we've given you a guide to see at least some of the forest. And I began with some pictures of some California icons that were closed. So let me end with some that are open. Tommy's for the chili cheeseburger, open 24 hours. Tito's Tacos just opened up, and get there early because there are lines around the block in Culver City. And of course, Cantor's, which isn't open for in-restaurant dining, but you can still get your pastrami to go. And with that, let me close the California forecast and turn it over to Lila, who's going to talk more about housing in California.
All right, so hopefully everyone should be seeing my screen now. and I'm going to talk to you today about some recent developments in housing markets. So a lot has happened this year, including in residential real estate. And I'm going to talk about two things, the coronavirus and the new state tenant protection law. So both have the potential to affect supply and demand in residential real estate. So to think about the future of housing markets, it's helpful to think about both of them. So here is a roadmap with some key takeaways that I'm going to talk about today. Sorry about that. So first is the coronavirus. So with respect to the coronavirus and the induced shutdown, I'm going to argue that an analysis of US counties through March suggests small negative effects on housing markets. With respect to the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which is a new state law that took effect this year, so January of 2020, it's a little bit too early to tell what's happening with the state law because it's only been a few months, but an analysis of existing laws in Los Angeles County suggests that these sorts of laws could reduce the quantity of rental housing available. So first, let's talk about the coronavirus. So one of the articles in the forecast book written by William shows some pretty striking graphs related to the coronavirus and the induced shutdown. And in some of them, you can start to see that not all areas were hit at the same time. And that's what you're seeing in this chart here. It shows you the variation in the first recorded case date in US counties. So what I do is I take all of the counties in the US and I find the first reported case date, so the first date they reported their coronavirus case, and I count the number of counties that reported their first case on each day since the middle of January and plot that here. So if there are no cases as of May 31st, then I put that county in that rightmost bar, which is why that bar is much taller than the others. So to make this a little more concrete, King County, which includes Seattle, reported its first official case on January 22nd. So King County shows up in that tiny little blue bar on the left. Lane County in Idaho reported its first case on March 18th. So that's where Lane County shows up in that March 18th bar. This is a photo of Ketchum, which is the main city in Lane County. And another county, Logan County in North Dakota, has had no reported cases or had no reported cases as of May 31st. So that's why Logan County, North Dakota is included in that rightmost bar, and that's a photo of Gackle, which is one of the cities in Logan County. So the previous chart I showed you indicated that the virus arrived in different counties at different times. So now the question is, how did the virus's arrival and how did the virus affect residential real estate? That's an important part of local economies. And what I'm going to do is to focus on the market for existing homes. And I'm going to use the variation in when the virus hit and the intensity of the virus to ask how the virus affects housing markets, particularly local housing markets at the county level. And the basic way to address this is to look across all counties at the relationship between housing markets and the virus. So if we do a naive analysis and look at the correlation, so for example, the correlation between the end of month cumulative case count in a county, so that roughly captures the timing and the intensity of the virus, and an indicator of housing markets, which could be the number of new listings or the number of sales, we actually get a positive correlation, so that the places hit harder and hit earlier actually have stronger housing markets in this correlation analysis. And that's a little bit surprising and sort of doesn't fit with what I expected or the story that I wanted to tell. So what's going on here? So the main problem with this correlation is, due to the nature of the virus. People carry the virus from place to place, and places that hit early and places that have had more cases are places that have more people coming and going, more people interacting, likely places with more active and robust economies. So think back to why King County in Washington, which includes Seattle, was hit earlier than Logan County in North Dakota, which is a very small, very rural, sparsely populated county. So a solution is that because I have multiple observations per county, I can look within counties over time, and this will control for level differences in the general strength of each county's economy. So when you do this, this is what you find, that 1,000 more cases in a county are associated with 5 fewer total listings, 15 fewer new listings, 74 fewer sales, and actually higher median sale prices of about $2,000. And these are all statistically significant at the 5% level. So a couple things I want to point out. So these results are for all US counties together. It's an aggregated analysis, and this is essentially assuming that the relationship that I'm showing you in this table, that these relationships between cases and housing markets are the same for all counties. Now, this is an assumption, and like most assumptions, it's helpful but probably not accurate in every single case. So it's probably not the case that this relationship holds for every single county in the US. That's just the nature of these sorts of regression analyses. And in fact, some preliminary evidence suggests that these relationships are stronger, or that cases matter more in sort of mid-sized counties. So that's one caveat. These effects, or these relationships, are seemingly small, but the data I have are only through March, and half of March was, I'd say, more normal than the second half. Also, you might be wondering about why we're seeing higher median sale prices. That's sort of an indicator of maybe stronger real estate markets. What's likely going on here is that these higher prices reflect negotiations and decisions that were made in January and February, when the world was, or at least when the US was, slightly more normal. So the bottom line, and the thing I want you to take away from this slide, is that there does appear that the virus has had mostly negative, though potentially small, effects on local residential real estate markets. It'll be interesting to see what the April and May data show, so I'm waiting for those to come out at the county level. And here we have some indications of lower supply and potentially lower demand, at least in the short run, with fewer listings and fewer sales. And what we're seeing again are these more sorts of quick, short run reactions. And the next event I want to talk about is one where long-term reactions are more relevant. And that is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019. This is another notable change for residential real estate markets this year, and it has the potential to affect markets in the medium to long term, because the law changes incentives for landlords and property owners, and when incentives change, then behavior typically changes as well. So to understand how and why, I want to talk about a few main provisions of the law. So first, there is a maximum allowable rent increase that is the smaller of 5% plus inflation and 10%. There are just cause eviction provisions, so essentially landlords can only evict tenants if there's a good reason. The law is in effect from January 1st of this year until January 1st of 2030. And there are exemptions. So for example, single family homes, condominiums, and buildings that are less than 15 years old are generally exempt from the law. And also, if a city or a locality has its own existing rent control law or rent stabilization ordinance or tenant protection law, that law remains in effect. And this is just the big picture of the law. I've brought there, there are a lot of other details, and I would refer any interested people to the California Legislative Information website, where you can find the full text of the law and all the details that I don't have time to go into. So now let's go back to incentives and talk about why these provisions might correspond to incentives for landlords and property owners. So the law potentially lowers the landlord and property owner's marginal benefit because of the rent increase caps. So landlords might decide on the margin to try to lower their marginal costs, perhaps by investing less in non-essential maintenance of the building, or perhaps by getting out of the market altogether. And some prior work suggests that these types of laws can affect both the quantity and the quality of rental properties available. So let me tell you what I mean. In San Francisco and Massachusetts, two separate analyses found that rent control laws tended to lower the supply, so lower the quantity of rental units available. The same study in Massachusetts found some evidence on the quality margin. So by that I mean rent-controlled units were found to have more neglected maintenance issues. For California, the new California law, it's a little bit too early to tell right now exactly what's going on and what the effects are because it has not been in effect for very long. So what I'm going to do is to look at cities in Los Angeles County that have had tenant protection laws in place for a while that have similar provisions to the provisions in the California law. So I want to know what I mean by tenant protection law, and I know this is a not legally and technically correct because technically rent control means something different than rent stabilization, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to use tenant protection law as a catch-all term for all of these types of laws and regulations. So what am I going to do? The basic question is, do tenant protection laws in Los Angeles County affect the rental market? And I'm going to focus on the quantity of response. So are there potentially fewer units available for rent because of these laws? The basic method that I'm going to use is to compare cities in Los Angeles with and without tenant protection laws. And in particular, I'm going to use the cities of West Hollywood, the city of Los Angeles, Santa Monica, and Beverly Hills. And each city has a slightly different law, and each city has a slightly different exemption start year. That's the term I'm going to use in this presentation. And by that, I mean the year where properties built after this year are exempt from the law. So for example, in Santa Monica, the exemption start year is 1979 because buildings built after 1979 are exempt. Also in these various city laws, generally condominiums are exempt. There are a lot of technical details, but at a high level, this will get us close for the analysis today. And given this, the landlord response I'm going to look at is a condo conversion. And what a condo conversion is when an existing building is converted into a condominium through an application and approval process, which possibly involves some renovations, but not a complete demolition. So the result is that, for example, an apartment building becomes a condominium, and this potentially reduces the quantity of rental properties available because individuals can own condominiums. So here are the results visually. I'm going to show you one city at a time. So let's start by looking at the city of Los Angeles. So this is showing you the fraction of properties classified in 2019 as converted condominiums. So converted condominium is a category of property that you can find in the assessor data. And the data are, the chart is showing you by the year that the property was built. So the x-axis is the building's construction year, the original construction year. The y-axis is what fraction of buildings originally built in that year are currently classified, so currently as of 2019, classified as a quote converted condo. So for example, of all the buildings in the city of Los Angeles built originally in 1971, about 40% are currently, so as of 2019, classified as a converted condominium. So that means at some point between 1971 and 2019, 40% of those buildings originally built in 1971 were converted to a condominium. And that black vertical line tells you where the exemption start year is for the particular city. So now we can look at Beverly Hills. And I want to end by looking at West Hollywood and showing you Santa Monica. And these charts generally say that there are more condo conversions in buildings that were originally the exemption start year than after. And this is especially the case with Santa Monica and West Hollywood. And this makes sense because these buildings built before the exemption start year are subject to the rent stable or the tenant protection laws. So if you convert the building to a condominium, they're generally going to be exempt. And you can show the same thing with regression analyses, but the picture suffices and shows you the same message that I want you to take away, which is that there is some evidence that these laws encouraged conversions to exempt buildings, so condos, potentially reducing the supply of rental stock. So very quickly, how might this translate to California? So there are numbers of similar provisions in the California law, but there are reasons to believe why the California law might have a smaller effect. And the main reason is that the 5% plus inflation rule is more lenient. So it allows a larger annual rent increase than are allowed in many of the laws in Los Angeles County. So the incentives for the state might change a little bit less. So what we're finding in Los Angeles County might be an upper bound for what ultimately ends up being the effect of the new state law. So to conclude, small negative effects on housing markets from the coronavirus and induced shutdown. With the tenant protection law in Los Angeles County, there's some evidence of reduced quantity of rental properties, and we'll have to wait and see what the effects will be at the state level. So that is all I have for today, and I'll turn it back over to Jerry.
Thank you, Lila. There we are. And to finish the forecast part, we have a conversation with John Tipton. John is a partner at the law firm of Allen Matkins. Allen Matkins has collaborated with the UCLA Anderson Forecast for 13 years now to produce a survey that is a forward-looking survey on commercial real estate, looking at 4 different categories of commercial real estate. Is particularly interesting this time as we're in a different kind of downturn, and how does that affect commercial real estate? Now, the full report will be out in a few weeks, but we'll give you a sneak preview in the following. So George, if you would bring up the conversation with John Tipton, that would be great.